Hey guys. This is part 7 of What If Sasuke Was in Lord of the Rings. Hit like and subscribe if you like this one, and also please check the author in the description. Let's start.
We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 26, Words of Purpose. Location: Dunharrow. Make way for the king! A soldier cried in the encampment at Dunharrow as Theoden and his riders, including those of the Fellowship who had stayed in Edoras, rode into the camp. Make way, the king is here. Theoden waved to the soldiers and riders that he passed, showing that he was there, and he was glad that they had come at his command. To his eye, the encampment was large and still growing. Grimbold, how many? He called out to the man as he passed him. I bring 500 men from the Westfold, my lord, Grimbold answered from where he stood amidst the tents. We have 300 more from Fenmarch, Thoden King, another of his soldiers told him. As he rode, he looked around, seeing the banners of the lords who had come. Where are the riders from Snowbourn? He asked. None have come, my lord, was the answer. Theoden shared a look with his riders. That was troubling news. They had been expecting a good number of riders from Snowbourn. For them to not be there was disheartening to hear. Not only that, but it carried with it the possibility that others had not come. Still, there was nothing they could do until they had all the numbers. They rode through the camp towards the cliff beneath the mountain. A path had been cut into the cliff long ago, and it had seen many years of use. It was no stranger to feet and hooves traveling upon it. At the top of the path was a small plateau where the main command had been set up long before Theoden and his riders had entered the camp. Once they were up there, they dismounted and began to pack their things away in the tents given to them. As the unpacking went on, Aragorn joined Theoden at the edge of the cliff. They looked down at the encampment below. There were a great many tents down there, and it was a sight to see. But from up on the cliff, the valley below looked more than half empty. 6,000 spears, less than half of what I had hoped for, Theoden remarked to Aragorn. 6,000 will not be enough to break the lines of Mordor, the ranger replied. Both knew that was true, but Theoden remained hopeful. More will come. He turned to walk away, only to stop when Aragorn spoke. Every hour lost hastens Gondor's defeat. We have until dawn, then we must ride. The king of Rohan nodded once in agreement. The sudden neighing of a horse in panic made them both turn to look at what was going on. The horses who had come up to the plateau were becoming nervous and frightened, trying to break free from where they had been tethered. Their riders came to their side, trying to calm them down with some success. Both Legolas and Gimli noticed this as they walked among the tents. They came upon Eomer as he took his saddle off of his horse. The horses are restless and the men are quiet, Legolas noted, looking around at the men of Rohan. They grow nervous in the shadow of the mountain, Eomer answered the elf. He looked over at the small passage that led deeper into the mountain, an area that looked dead and barren to the world. Both elf and dwarf looked at what the man was looking at and felt unease travel up their spines. That road there, Gimli said. Where does that lead? Eomer did not answer, but Legolas did. It is the road to the Deholt, the door under the mountain. None who venture there ever return, Eomer told them. That mountain is evil. As if he felt uneasy just speaking about it, he turned and walked away. Aragorn came near the entrance, attracted to it for some reason he found to be chilling. It crawled across his skin as he kept on looking. Something seemed to tell him that he would go there, that something would be waiting for him. But there was another part of him that was telling him to not go, to turn and walk away, that what at the end of that road was something he should not go near. As a rider calmed down his frightened horse and led it away, an image appeared at the entrance, glowing with a sickly green light. It showed a man that had long been dead. Aragorn could barely make out features, but there wasn't enough there to give him a good picture. Yet somehow, the image seemed to be beckoning to come forward, either that or telling him to stay away. Aragorn, said Gimli, touching his arm and making him jump slightly. The ranger turned to look at the dwarf. Let's find some food, the dwarf suggested with a weary look at the entrance before walking away. When Aragorn looked back, the image was gone. As the night fell around the camp, Eowyn and Mary were alone in a tent. The reason for that was because she was helping him try out the armor he had been given by Theoden before leaving Edoras. There. A true esquire of Rohan, she declared after placing his helmet on his head. Mary reached up and felt the helmet on his head, confirming for himself that it was on. "I'm ready," he said excitedly, whipping out his sword. The move surprised Eowyn and made her jump back. But it also made her laugh a little. "Sorry. It isn't all that dangerous," he apologized. "It's not even sharp." "Well, that's no good," she remarked. "You won't kill many orcs with a blunt blade." She turned him around and pushed him gently out of the tent. "Come on." They came out with a good air about them. He was practicing swinging the sword through the air, and she couldn't help but smile at the sight. It reminded her of better days when she was a child along with her brother and her cousin, playing at war. "To the smithy, go!" she told him. He ran off, leaving her behind. Her brother sat at a fire nearby beside Gimli. "You should not encourage him," he told her. "You should not doubt him," she replied, looking at his back. "I do not doubt his heart, only the reach of his arm." Gimli laughed at those words, but it was a short and quiet laugh. "Why should Mary be left behind?" Eowyn asked. "He has as much cause to go to war as you." She watched as the hobbit disappeared behind a tent. "Why can he not fight for those he loves?" Eomer turned his head to look at her, knowing full well what she was talking about in that moment. When she turned away, he stood up from his seat. "You know as little of war as that hobbit," he said to his sister. "When the fear takes him, and the blood and the screams and the horror of battle take hold, do you think he would stand and fight? He would flee. And he would be right to do so." He placed what he thought was a comforting hand on her shoulder. "War is the province of men, Eowyn." He turned and walked back to the fire, never noticing how his sister looked at him in that moment. Location: Sasuke. Night had fallen over Minas Tirith. Sasuke walked down a street that was empty, letting his footsteps echo against the stone walls of the houses and buildings. He was not surprised that the street was so empty, for the day had been a flurry of activity across all the levels. The shinobi had been surprised at how patriotic the citizens of Minas Tirith actually were to their city. Every man and boy who had been conscripted into service did so without objection or protest, going willing with the recruiters. Those who were too young or too old to serve helped out in anywhere they could, the youngest often taking messages from one commander to another, the eldest donating their old weapons and armor when there wasn't enough. Even the girls and women helped by mending clothes and passing out food to the soldiers. Truly, it was a sight to see. But for Sasuke, seeing such things only reminded him of how bad a situation they were in. They may be patriotic, but to the shinobi, everything that they did had a motive of fear. They were afraid. He knew it well enough, having experienced it before, that night when he came home to find his entire clan slaughtered and his brother standing over their parents' corpses. Once, a long time ago, he would have banished that thought away in an instant, refusing to think about it or his brother. Now, he did not care. That night was long in the past and was different than what he had originally thought. There was really no point in thinking about it anymore. Wanting to think of something different, his eyes roamed the street and found a wooden plank hanging from a building. The fact that there was a tankard painted on the plank, lights dancing through the window, and voices faintly coming from inside all told him that it was a tavern. Suddenly, he felt a need for a drink. When he opened the door, all voices went silent and all eyes fell to him. The people inside recognized him as one of those who rode with Mithrandir and who had fought off the Nazgul. They watched in silence as he walked amongst them to an empty table in the far back. He signaled one of the serving girls and she came closer with nervous feet. "I'll take a tankard," he said quietly, placing money down on the table. "Of course, my lord," she answered. Her voice showed her nervousness, but her face was blushing. She quickly walked away, leaving him alone. If he had been an idiot, or worse, Naruto, he would have thought nothing of her blush. But he was not an idiot, and knew full well what it meant. But as before, he simply did not care. She came back with his tankard and he took it without a word. She left, and he drank the ale. It was bitter going down his throat, but he still drank it. He put it down when he was done, and let what he had drunk travel down into his throat. The bitterness of it made him wish that he had some sake with him. He had some before he left the elemental nations, and even though he had drank ale and mead while in Middle-earth, he much rather had sake. Someone sat down on the other side of the table, getting his attention. "What do you want?" he asked the old man. "How is this possible?" the old man said, mostly to himself. "It's been 60 years and yet, you don't look like you have aged at all." Frowning slightly, he pushed away the tankard. This was probably going to require his complete attention. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "I've never met you before, old man." The old man looked at him sharply, trying to see something with his own eyes. "How could you? We never met in person. But I remember you. It's been over 60 years and I still remember that night when you fought that dragon. I thought I had been dreaming until I saw you fend off the ringwraiths. The Vala of purple flame that was summoned, it almost the same as the one I saw when Smaug the dragon had been slain." "Oh, now I understand," Sasuke thought to himself. "You were at Lake Town then, when Thorin's company retook Erebor." "Yes, I was there." "And so were you, dragon dueler." The people in the tavern began to whisper amongst themselves at those words. They had all heard of the Battle of 5 Armies, the retaking of Erebor, and the duel around Lake Town. They had thought the last to just be a story, but now, it sounded like it was real. Here was a man who claimed to be there, and he sat before a man he was claiming was the same person who fought Smaug. But Sasuke didn't care about that kind of thing. "I'm not the man you're looking for," he said shortly. "Don't deny it, I know your appearance, and it hasn't changed a bit these past 6 decades. He raised his voice to an almost shouting level. "Grandfather, please come back to the table," a soldier who looked barely old enough to be not called a teenager said to the old man, coming over to the table and placing a firm, yet gentle hand on his shoulder. "Let us leave this man alone with his drink." His grandfather did not refuse or protest such action, which showed he must have been in this kind of situation before. He stood up from the table and they both turned to leave to back to a table they had been sitting alone at. "Wait," Sasuke said suddenly, making them both stop. He eyed the soldier. There was something familiar about him. "I know you from somewhere, don't I?" "I did not think you would remember, my lord," the soldier said, looking at him again. "I'm not a lord. Where have we met before?" "It was 8 years ago, he faltered under the gaze of the raven-haired stranger before amending his words to "Sir. You had tracked an orc pack through the western lands of Gondor, eventually finding them in a ruined village. When you had struck and killed all the orcs but found no children, you searched the entire village. And when you finally looked in a tiny storage room, I almost had my eye poked out by a kid holding a sword and was shaking so bad that I was surprised the sword didn't fly out of his hands," he continued. "I told him that if he wanted the chance to see his parents again, he would need to put the sword down," the soldier finished. "I was that child, sir. You took me back to Minas Tirith and reunited me with my family who had fled there. You disappeared before anyone could thank you." There was no need for thanks. He looked the soldier over and saw the little boy who had wet himself while holding the sword all those years ago. But that frightened little boy wasn't there anymore. "You've grown," he noted, taking a drink from his tankard. "You see?" the old man asked. "He has saved my life and your life, grandson. Truly, the Vala have sent us a man to watch over us." "No, they didn't," Sasuke told him bluntly. "They must have," he insisted. "Trust me, they didn't, and I can prove it to you with a simple fact. The man who was at Lake Town all those years ago wasn't me, but my ancestor. But the mere fact that could call upon a Vala encased in an armor of purple fire," he began to say. "It's not a Vala. It's simply a gift of my clan." Both were stunned by the news. "There are more of you?" the soldier asked him. "Will they come to our aid?" He frowned a little. "No, they won't come. I'm the last one." They both saw the look on his face, and their backs stiffened. "Oh, my apologies, sir," said the soldier. "I did not mean to sound rude." He didn't say anything in reply, which made them feel like it was time to leave him alone. "I could use some company," he said suddenly. "Why don't you two sit down, and you tell me how you've been these past couple of years? he suggested to the soldier. It was something that he hadn't done before, talking to a kid he had saved years after the fact. But now was as good a time as any. Both the grandfather and the soldier smiled a little. We would like that, sir, the soldier told him. Location: Dunharrow. When Aragorn had awoken from his sleep, he had leapt up with dagger in hand. He had had a nightmare of Arwen and what lay beyond the road into the mountain. It was confusing and disorienting to say the least. So when a guard stood at the entrance of his tent, tell him that Theoden wanted him, he was glad for the news. When he entered the king's tent, he found a cloaked and hooded stranger sitting in a chair with Theoden standing before him. The Lord of the Mark turned when he heard Aragorn come in. I take my leave, he declared, walking towards the tent flap. He paused for a moment before the ranger, and Aragorn thought he saw something in the king's eyes. But he walked past before that thing could be figured out. Once the two of them were alone, the stranger stood up from his chair and removed his hood. Aragorn immediately bowed his head. My Lord Elrond, he said with the utmost respect in his voice to the elf who had raised him. I come on behalf of one whom I love, Elrond declared, earning a small look of confusion from the man. Arwen is dying. The confusion was replaced with fear. She will not long survive the evil that now spreads from Mordor. The light of the Evenstar is failing. As Sauron's power grows, her strength wanes. Arwen's life is now tied to the fate of the ring. The shadow is upon us, Aragorn. The end has come. It will not be our end, but his, Aragorn promised his foster father. The elf looked at him with the barest looks of mockery. You ride to war but not to victory. Sauron's armies ride on Minas Tirith, this you know. But in secret he sends another force, which will attack from the river. A fleet of corsair ships sails from the south. They will be in this city in 2 days. You're outnumbered, Aragorn, he told the ranger. You need more men. There are none. All they had were the 6,000 spears Rohan now brought to Gondor's aid. For a moment, there was silence in the tent. There are those that dwell in the mountain. As those words were spoken, Aragorn heard a hiss of breath draw against his skin. The wind picked up around, a cold hard wind, there for a second before disappearing. Murderers, traitors, he said with a hard tone in his voice. He knew what lay in the mountain. You would call upon them to fight? They believe in nothing. They answer to no one. The elf lord's gaze hardened at those accusing words. They will answer to the king of Gondor. He pushed back his cloak and pulled a familiar-looking sword out from beneath it. Andúril, the flame of the west, forged from the shards of Narsil, he declared to Aragorn, coming towards him, holding the blade in both hands. Aragorn walked toward the elf, meeting him halfway. He knew the hilt that was before him, having seen it many times before in Rivendell. It had sat so long alongside the other shards of Narsil, but now they were remade. With hesitating hands, he reached out and took the sword. Sauron will not have forgotten the sword of Elendil, he remarked, flipping it over so that the hilt was within his grasp. A hesitating hand reached for it, but once he felt the grip in his hand, all hesitation vanished, and he pulled out the sword to see it in its full glory. The blade that was broken shall return to Minas Tirith, he declared. The man who can wield the power of this sword can summon to him an army more deadly than any that walks this earth, Elrond told him. Put aside the ranger. Become who you were born to be. Take the Deholt road. He could see that there was still doubt in the man before him. So he said something he had said once before. One in Iastaladáin, I gave hope to the Dúnedain. Aragorn stiffened slightly at those words. They had spoken to him when he had first left Rivendell to join the Rangers of the North. Then, he had been a boy who was going to become a ranger. Now, his life had changed once more. And he accepted it. Uchabin Estalanum, I have kept no hope for myself, the king of Gondor replied, sheathing the sword. Location: Izuna. He found a small spot alone to practice what few katas he had learned. He found that he could not sleep easily tonight. Perhaps it was because of where they were resting for the night, or perhaps it was because it was actually riding to war, he did not know. You move well, a voice said from behind him, making him stop in mid-punch. He turned to see another elf standing before his small spot. Thank you, he said respectfully in reply. Tell me, do you wield eglows? He frowned slightly at those words. No one who didn't know about the weapon asked about it. I do. How do you know about it? I have known its first wielder. I was his herald at the end of the Second Age. His eyes widened instantly at that news and quickly bowed his head. My Lord Elrond, he said with the utmost respect. I have heard of you from Lady Galadriel. And are you from her? The elf lord said in reply. Raise your head and tell me, why are you out here in this night? I cannot sleep, my lord. I do not know why. Elrond looked at him for a long second, his eyes searching for something. You are afraid, he finally declared. If Izuna was still the half-elf he had been in Lothlorien, he would have protested and denied the fact. But he wasn't, and he accepted that he would face fear. I might be, but it hasn't robbed me of the chance to sleep before. There was a small hint of surprise in the older elf's eyes. You do not deny that fear can take hold of you. My sensei taught how to properly use it. Perhaps not entirely, he said in reply. You know that you may die, but you fear for those you consider close. You fear that they are going to die. A half-bitter, half-reminiscent smile appeared on his lips. Your grandsire was the same. He cared for his companions and his kingdom. The half-elf fell silent at those words. He had not known his grandsire, and could only rely on other people telling him. What would he think of all I have done? He would be proud of you and happy that you wield his weapon with honor and courage. He would be proud that you ride to war with your fellow king and friend, just as he did with King Elendil. He turned away and began walking. Aragorn is going to walk a different road this night, and it is your decision to stay or go with him. But if you stay, you will ride with the Rohirrim to Minas Tirith. I had planned to do that before you came, my lord, he declared. I thought you would. And so there is a gift waiting for you in your tent. Hail and farewell, Izuna, grandson of Gil-galad, High King of the Noldor, the Lord of Rivendell said with a bowed head before continuing his stride away from the half-elf. His fears strangely put to ease, Izuna turned to head for his tent. He might not go with Aragorn as they could not fully abandon the men of Rohan, but there was something he could do. Aragorn strode forward toward the Dimholt road, his hand holding the reins to his horse. His heart felt a little heavy as he walked. Eowyn had found him as he was packing his supplies onto the saddle and begged him not to leave. In doing so, she had all but confessed to him, and he rejected her, gently as he could, but rejected all the same. As he passed the tent, Gimli stood up from where he was sitting, fully clothed and holding his weapons. Just where do you think you're off to? He asked the man. His intention was clear and Aragorn would not have it. Not this time. This time you must stay, Gimli, he told the dwarf. Have you learned nothing of the stubbornness of dwarves? Legolas asked him as he came up beside him with another horse. By his side was Hugo, who stood there in silence. You might as well accept it. We're going with you, laddie, Gimli declared. He could not help but smile at them. The smile faded somewhat as his gaze turned onto Hugo. Why do you come? He asked. You owe no loyalty to me. Izuna had asked me to come and keep an eye on you, the orange-haired shinobi told him. On normal grounds he would have refused, believing that it would be best to follow what Sasuke had instructed him to do. But Izuna had asked him, not commanded or ordered, just like his sensei. Aragorn had a feeling that if they tried to dissuade him from the course he was joining them on, it would not work. Very well, you can ride with me. That will not be necessary. I'll walk. His voice was quiet but would have no argument. Once they were on the path, those who would ride mounted the horses. They began to make their way to the beginning of the road. It seemed like the whole of the camp was watching them as they left to go into the darkness of the mountain. Lord Aragorn! Called out one soldier, but his call fell on deaf ears. Aragorn vanished into the darkness, with Legolas, Gimli, and Hugo not far behind him. Why does he leave on the eve of battle? Another soldier asked. It was a question they were all asking themselves. He leaves because there is no hope, Gimli answered. He leaves because he must, Theoden replied. All eyes turned to look at the king. Too few have come, his man said in protest. We cannot defeat the armies of Mordor. No, we cannot. A sense of unease filled the air at those words. Their king was admitting to something that they did not wish to hear. However, that sense vanished when he said, "But we will meet them in battle nonetheless." The sense of unease left at those words. They knew their oath and they would come to the aid of their allies. "You will not ride alone," Izuna's voice spoke out, making all eyes turn to him. They found him dressed in elven armor of such craft and make that it put the armor that the elves had worn at Helm's Deep to shame, a cuirass and fault of interlocking lames of steel plate over a hauberk of fine mail, together with pauldrons and braces and included leather pants. The armor was blued and etched with vine-like tracery, and the plates were embossed with Tengwar symbols. At the throat was an insignia of 12 stars on a midnight blue field. In his hand was Aglos with its tip pointing skyward. "I ride with you." There were still some who doubted, Gomling among them. "My lord, you are but one man, even if you are the Untainted," he said to them. "What can you do to aid us?" "I can ride alongside you and join you in the battle that is to come. I may be one person, but I carry a promise that was made near the end of the Second Age, a promise made between two kings." "What promise is that?" Theoden asked him. "The promise between Elendil and Gil-galad that when they rode to war, they rode together. Now I offer that same promise to you, Theoden King. I will ride beside you as had my grandsire, the High King of the Noldor, rode beside the High King of the Dundane." His words made others look at him with surprise on their faces. "You claim lineage from Gil-galad?" Gomling asked him. "He is my mother's sire. I wield his spear and I bear his armor." He looked at the King of Rohan. "I offer you my promise." He offered his empty hand. "And I accept it," Theoden told him, taking the hand in a firm grasp. Location: the Deholt Road. What kind of army would linger in such a place? Gimli asked aloud as they rode down the path. He may be a dwarf and be comfortable around mountains and stone, but this path made him feel uneasy and nervous. "One that is cursed," Legolas answered. "Long ago the men of the mountains swore an oath to the last king of Gondor, to come to his aid, to fight. But when the time came, when Gondor's need was dire, they fled vanishing into the darkness of the mountain. And so Isildur cursed them, never to rest until they had fulfilled their pledge." As they rode on and watched as the path grew narrower and narrower, words came to the elf, words that he felt needed to be spoken. "Who shall call them from the grey twilight, the forgotten people? The heir of him to whom the oath they swore. From the north shall he come, need shall drive him. He shall pass the door to the paths of the dead." Aragorn looked back at his friend as those words were spoken. They were from a prophecy that had been spoken a long time ago. But now, they hung over his head, reminding him of why he had chosen to come down this path. Soon, the four of them came upon the entrance to the mountain. Those who were riding dismounted and held the reins of the horses as they walked forward. The end of the road lay in what could have been called a grove of trees, if the trees were not dead and were in a more pleasant place. It was in front of a door cut into the mountain, surrounded by skulls and ominous symbols carved into the stone. "The very warmth of my blood seems stolen away," Gimli said as they drew closer. As they drew closer, Legolas began to read the symbols on the door. "The way is shut. It was made by those who are dead and the dead keep it. The way is shut." As those words were said, Hugo felt his blood go cold. Every instinct he had, even those that urged him to let loose and slaughter everything in his path, told him to turn and flee. But he couldn't. He had been asked to watch out for Aragorn, and he would do just that. A wind came screeching out of the door, making the horses start to panic. Shaking their heads and reins free from the grasps of Legolas and Aragorn, they turned and fled back down the path. "Brego!" shouted Aragorn after his horse, but it would not turn back to him. Instead it fled out of sight. He turned back to the door and held Andúril aloft. "I do not fear death," he proclaimed, walking through the door and into the darkness. Both Legolas and Hugo followed him, leaving Gimli alone outside. "Well, this is a thing unheard of," he said aloud. "An elf will go underground, where a dwarf dare not. Oh, I'd never hear the end of it." With a quick little run, he followed his friends into the mountain. End. Chapter 27, The Beginning. Location: Dunharrow. When morning came, the great encampment of Rohan's riders was quickly being dismantled. Tents were pulled down, fires were being extinguished, supplies were being collected, and those who were done with their duties mounted their horses and were ready to ride, heading for the rallying point. In the midst of all the chaos, Theoden and Eomer came out of the king's tent, heading for their horses. "We must ride light and swift," the king told his nephew. "It is a long road ahead and man and beast must reach the end with the strength to fight." Eomer wordlessly agreed with him. They mounted their horses and began to ride out of the camp, a guard forming up behind them. But before they went to the rallying point, Theoden took notice of Merry, fully armored and readying his pony, and rode over to him. Hearing the sound of hoof beats behind him, the hobbit turned to look at the king. "Little hobbits do not belong in war, Master Meriadoc," he said. "All my friends have gone to battle," Merry protested. "I would be ashamed to be left behind. It is a 3-day gallop to Minas Tirith, and none of my riders can bear you as a burden. I want to fight." "I will say no more," the king declared, urging his horse forward. Eomer and his guard followed, leaving the hobbit behind. Izuna took note of what happened and rode forward to meet Theoden. "You did not need to do that," he said to the king quietly amidst the controlled chaos. "Merry can hold his own in a fight." "A war is different than a fight, Master Izuna," Theoden replied. "And I would rather have Master Meriadoc keep his innocence for a little while longer. He deserves that much from me," he added the half-elf. "Would you make some vague remark about your innocence?" He shook his head. "I made a promise to you, from a grandson of a king to a king. I will not back from that promise now. And I thank you for it." After that little talk, Izuna broke off from Theoden's group to just watch the rest of them gather. From where he was watching, he had a perfect view of Merry being picked up by a rider and placed in the saddle. The rider looked young and had a helmet on that hid most of his face. But Izuna had a hunch and activated his Sharingan to see if he was right. It turned out that he was, his eyes all but screaming the truth at him. He deactivated the jutsu and hid a small smile to himself. "Your secret is safe with me, my lady," he silently promised. "Form up, move out!" Eomer shouted to the riders, spurring them into greater action. "Form up, move out!" "Ride! Ride now to Gondor," Theoden called out to his men, riding at the head of the army. They all followed him as they left Dunharrow in a great flood of horses. Location: the Path of the Dead. There was only a single torch burning inside the cave once they were out of sight of the door. The fire burning on it seemed weak and almost sickly looking at first glance, but once Aragorn took it in hand, it burned more brightly. But that might not have been a good thing. The tunnel that was before them was long, narrow, and filled with wisps of smoke. Any path that split off from the main was short and filled with skulls, human skulls. While Aragorn kept his eyes focused on the path that they had to follow, Legolas' eyes fell upon the skulls. Soon, they began to look around the cavern walls themselves, as if looking through them. "What is it?" Gimli asked him, recognizing that he was seeing beyond. "What do you see?" "I see shapes of men, and of horses," he answered, still looking as he walked forward. The dwarf looked but saw nothing, making him ask, "Where?" Legolas did not answer him. Instead, he kept looking around. Pale banners like shreds of cloud. Spears rise like winter thickets through a shroud of mist. His words made all four of them feel cold inside, but also like they were being watched from a place they could not see. "The dead are following," he declared. "They have been summoned." "The dead? Summoned?" asked Gimli as he swung around to look at where they had come from but saw nothing. "I knew that," he declared, putting on a small show of bravado, like nothing there bothered him. "Very good. Very good." When he saw that he was alone in that part of the tunnel, he quickly shouted, "Legolas!" and went after his friends. Hugo watched quietly as the dwarf quickly rejoined them. "I thought you were a dwarf," he said with a straight face. "Aren't you supposed to know your way through tunnels instinctively?" Gimli frowned and would have said something in reply, had Aragorn not said, "Keep your focus on the path. It would not be wise to be distracted here." It was good advice, and they paid heed to it. They followed him deeper into the tunnel, even as the feeling of being watched grew as they went. It was when they came across what could only be called a mote of fog that the feeling actually became visible. The only way to continue following the path was to walk through the moat, and the second they did, ghostly hands reached up to take hold of them. Despite the attempt, they could not hold the living. For every time they turned whist walking through the moat of fog, the living brushed the ghostly hands away like they were a simple breeze. Gimli took a more panicked and exaggerated approach by blowing and waving the hands away. Still Aragorn led them through the moat, torch in one hand and Andúril in the other. He tried to not let the hands consume him with worry and fear as he moved forward. When he looked down, he shot his eyes back up. "Do not look down," he told the others. Having heard that, and hearing something cracked beneath his foot, Gimli looked down and saw that through the fog, they had been walking on a bed of skulls. Even Legolas was disturbed by what they were walking on. The only person who wasn't was Hugo. Once they were out of the moat, both the elf and the dwarf looked at him. "How is it that you could walk through such a thing without a hint of fear on your face?" Legolas asked him. "I've walked through worse," he answered. What he didn't tell them was that what he walked through was usually of his own doing. "We must keep moving," Aragorn told them, leading the way forward again. Location: Sasuke. He had spent the night, and the next at that tavern, listening to what people had to say and sharing tales of where he had been and what he had seen. He had a talent for describing things he did not think he had. The people at the tavern enjoyed what he had to tell them, always eager for more stories of other places. More so were the soldier and his grandfather, who shared the same name, Otter. They sat with him at the table and listened to what he had to offer. He found that he had enjoyed their company. But as the night faded away and the day came, Sasuke found himself walking alongside both Otters on the wall, smiling a little as they talked to one another. "Have you ever been inside Erebor?" he asked old Otter. "Aye, once," the grandfather replied. "But it had been shortly after the dragon had attacked and the king under the mountain had fallen. I did not see its full glory." A wistful look came upon his face. "I think I would like to." "Ah, I probably won't. I'll be lucky if I survive what's coming." "Don't say that, grandfather," his grandson told him. "You will live." "Don't tell me something that's not likely to be true, lad. I'm old and I will probably not live for long." "What say you, lad?" he asked Sasuke, turning his attention to the raven-haired man. "Do you think I will live?" "Are you fighting?" Sasuke asked back. "No, I'm too old." "Then you'll be fine." He looked at the raven-haired man and barked out a short laugh that would have made him start coughing if he had kept it up. "You like to keep your answers short. You remind me of my old drill sergeant when you talk like that." "That would be a first," he remarked quietly. He had met a few drill sergeants in his travels in Gondor, and he could honestly say that he had never been compared to one. Then again, he had never really been compared to anyone that weren't his family. He had noticed that young Otter had fallen silent as he stared out to the fields. "What's wrong?" he asked, instantly becoming alert. "They're here," young Otter said in a voice that barely came out of his throat. Both his grandfather and Sasuke came to the wall to look over its side. In the morning light, they could see what he was seeing. A seemingly endless horde of orcs had poured out of Osgiliath and were marching upon Minas Tirith. It would not take long for them to reach the city walls. The sound of their feet marching across the earth and the drums banging under the smog emitting from Mordor echoed into their ears. "Vala have mercy on us," old Otter said in a strangled whisper as he saw the siege towers being pushed towards the walls, leading the way for the legions. "There won't be any mercy," Sasuke told him, his voice never changing. "Not for us and not for them." From the city's higher levels, bells began to ring out, letting the capital of Gondor know of the danger outside its walls. "The bells are ringing," the eldest of the three said, taking notice of the sound. "They must carry." He quickly went over to a nearby bell and began ringing it fiercely, adding to the sound. Yet it seemed like the city still slept while the bells rang and the horde of Mordor marched onwards to the city. "Where are they?" young Otter demanded, looking around to see his fellow soldiers. "They won't be here right at this moment," Sasuke told him, gesturing to the horde still making its way to the walls. "The bells are doing their job. We have some time to prepare, and we must take advantage of it. Go find your armor and weapons, Otter. Go find your commander." "What about you, sir?" he asked, turning to look at him. "I'll be on the wall fighting. Now go." The soldier turned and ran while he watched the enemy march closer and closer. Then he turned away and leapt into the air, using the speed he had been trained to master to reach his equipment. When the sun was fully raised, the soldiers of Gondor manned the walls. Despite having enough forces to not be stretched thin, there were only enough to man the first 2 levels, and what remained of Faramir's rangers manned the second wall. What little reserves they had were placed behind the walls of the second level so they could quickly reach the first if called upon. The man himself stood on the first wall, clad in the heavy armor of Gondor's soldiers, his brother's shield on his left arm and the horn at his side. To his left stood Gandalf with Glamdring drawn, and to his right stood Sasuke, fully armored and with his hand on the katana. Pippin had volunteered to join the fight but had been placed with the reserves. The horde of Mordor was now within easy sight of the walls, and they intimidated the soldiers of Gondor even more. Their catapults and siege towers were crudely built, that was plain to see. But there were many of them, and it was very likely they had plenty of rubble to use for the catapults. But for them, they would have to be very careful. If they used what scare rubble they had too quickly, the trebuchets would end being useless. Lord Faramir, there are too many for the trebuchets, a soldier told the man after running up to him. What are we to do? Do not fire until I give the command, he answered, his eyes fixed on the horde. Understood, my lord, the soldier said, saluting him before turning to run back and pass on the order. What are you planning to have the trebuchets fire on? Gandalf asked him. The catapults and siege towers once they are closer to hit, he answered. If we can destroy them, perhaps we can make this siege last longer. And hope for reinforcements. That was what was on each and every soldier's mind as they watched the horde before them get closer and closer. When it finally stopped, it was like they could try to count the number of orcs standing before the walls and easily get lost in their numbers. Before, people had been wondering why it had taken them so long to march out from Osgiliath to Minas Tirith when Faramir and his men managed to flee in much less shorter time. Now it made more sense, the number of orcs and trolls were massive. Fear began to mount in the soldiers as they looked on the numbers before them. Sure, they had more men than they originally had and the civilians had been evacuated to the higher levels, but just looking out at the horde from Mordor made them pause. If they ever got past the gate and through the defenses, it didn't matter how high the civilians had been evacuated to. The orcs would come in like a plague, killing all in their path. There was movement among the orcs, drawing the eye of the men on the walls. The crudely built catapults were being pulled back into firing position with the orcs moving hastily around each and every one of them. It was obvious that they were about open fire. Stand ready! Faramir shouted. The order carried down the walls and the soldiers shifted their feet and held their shields higher. As if in response, the orc catapults fired their payload, sending right up onto and a little over the walls. The men on the walls raised their shields over their heads to deflect whatever it was about to hit them. They were expecting stones big enough to either crush them or stun them long enough to be overwhelmed. What had struck them wasn't that damaging but much more horrible. Cries of shock and horror began to grow amongst the ranks as what hit them fell to the ground, allowing to be seen. When one landed close to Faramir's feet and he saw what it was, he understood. He knew that in the mass panic that preceded the retreat from Osgiliath, more than a few of his men did not make out of the city. And now he knew what had happened to them, for he was staring at the head of one of those men, dried blood caking the neck and a look of horror frozen on the face. The orcs must have tortured them before finally granting them the mercy of death. He felt shock and horror at the sight, just like the rest of the men under his command. There was a nauseous feeling in his stomach, like he would soon empty its contents, and from the sound of it, there were already men doing just that. But he felt more than just that. He also felt anger and rage. He had lost good men and they were treated like this. It was unacceptable. Silence! He roared to the soldiers, stifling their cries and making them all look upon him. He looked back, all of them, purposely ignoring what lay outside the walls. We have lost men and it was cruel how we lost them. But do not waste time and strength for them now. We will mourn them later. He pointed his finger out at the fields. Now is the time when we face our enemies with steel in our hearts and in our hands. Now is the time to show that the White City, the City of Kings, the city that we have fought for since it became the last shield of Gondor, will not fall so easily. He drew his sword and held it high. He remembered how his brother stood amongst the ruins of Osgiliath after taking back, and for his brother, the Captain General of Minas Tirith, he shouted, "For Gondor!" As he spoke, the fear and horror that lay in the eyes of the soldiers disappeared. What replaced them were steel, fortitude, strength, and the desire to defend their city, to spill orc blood. At his cry, they clashed their spears against their shields. "For Gondor!" they cried in return. "For Gondor!" he shouted again. "For Gondor!" they repeated louder, clashing their shields and spears against each other harder. "For Gondor!" he shouted one last time. "For Gondor!" they shouted with him, making the sound of their spears and shields echo in the air. They were no longer afraid. They would defend and protect their city. Sasuke took a step forward, his eyes transforming into the Mangekyo Sharingan. What he was thinking of doing at that moment barely required the use of the Susanoo, but it still required it all the same. Some soldiers stepped away from him as the purple fire appeared and formed into a semblance of ribs along with a pair of skeletal arms and hands. One hand had a rough shape of a bow attached to it, the other cradled an orb of black fire. In rapid succession, the orb manifested an arrow, knocked it to the bow, drew back the string, and fired. It flew through the air from the wall and struck one of the orc catapults. He didn't stop there, firing more arrows at the catapult in his range, destroying them all and setting them ablaze. At the beginning, the soldiers on the wall just watched in silent surprise as the catapults that had delivered their dead comrades back to them collapsed in black flame, taking the orcs nearest with them. Then they laughed and cheered at the sight. Location: the Path of the Dead. They pushed forward through the tunnel, haste and fear quickening their steps. The tunnel seemed to close in around them, intent on swallowing them all. But just as it felt like they would be trapped inside, they came out into a large cavern. They kept their backs to one another while staying in loose formation, always moving in a circular movement. The cavern only had half of a floor to walk upon with fog so thick they could not see their feet. The other half just sleepy dropped sheer into an abyss. The other side of the cavern wall seemed so far away when they looked at it. In the wall that had a ground to walk on, a large temple-like structure had been carved out of it, but they barely paid any attention to it. As they moved, they looked for any signs of the dead who waited there, but saw nothing. "Who enters my domain?" a voice hissed in the air and in their ears. They swung their heads to look at the structure, for it seemed that the voice was coming from there. In front of it stood a ghost colored in a pale green light. Its robes were tattered and old, showing the bones underneath, and its hair was unkempt and stringy. But there was no mistaking the sword it wore around its belt or the crown atop its head. "One who will have your allegiance," Aragorn declared, facing the ghost straight in the eye while holding both the torch and Enduro high. The Ghost King was amused by those words. They could see it on his skeletal face. "The dead do not suffer the living to pass," he told them. "You will suffer me," the ranger said. The ghost just laughed, and his laugh echoed in the cavern. The same green light that illuminated him now shined throughout the cavern, carving great buildings from nothingness, effectively creating a city. And from that city, the dead came forth, marching towards their king with weapons in their hands. "The way is shut," the king of the dead said to the living as his army came closer, repeating the words Legolas had read from the door. "It was made by those who are dead, and the dead keep it." At those words, more ghosts appeared by his side, encircling the four living people. They began to walk slowly towards them, their intention clear. "The way is shut. Now you must die." Legolas instantly knocked an arrow and fired it at the ghost, only to watch as it flew through and clattered against the ground. Gimli raised his axe and Hugo clenched his fists, but Aragorn strode forward to meet the king of the dead. "I summon you to fulfill your oath," he commanded, releasing his grasps on the torch. Those words seemed to make the ghost angry, for his pace quickened at them. "None but the king of Gondor may command me," he growled, drawing his sword and raising it high. With a scream, he swung it down, intent on cleaving the man before him. But Aragorn swung Andúril up to meet the ghostly blade, the sound of them clashing together echoing through the cavern. The Ghost King was stunned by what happened, and the King of Gondor used that moment to swing their blades down, disengaging at the last moment. That line was broken, the King of the Dead protested. In response, the King of Gondor grabbed him by the neck, feeling it in the grasp of his hand, and held his sword to it as well. It has been remade, he replied in a whisper. He pushed the ghost back away from him, but did not go after him. Instead, he held his ground and looked at all the ghosts there. Fight for us and regain your honor, he told them. What say you? He began to move slowly amongst them, holding Anduro high. What say you? He asked once more to the ghosts who backed away as he came close. ACH. You waste your time, Aragorn, Gimli told him. They had no honor in life and they have none now in death. But he did not hear the dwarf, or chose not to hear him. I am Isildur's heir. Fight for me and I will hold your oaths fulfilled, he told them all, brandishing his sword at every ghost he could see before finally leveling it at their king. What say you? But the King of the Dead only began to laugh at him. While he laughed, he and the army he commanded started to fade away from sight. You have my word, Aragorn promised as they disappeared. Fight, and I will release you from this living death. What say you? But they did not stop until they were gone. Stand, you traitors! Shouted Gimli to no avail. The army of the dead was gone, and the fog that had covered the ground was blown away by a cold wind. A rumble emerged from the ground and cracks began to form in the walls and ceiling. At first, it only seemed like dust fell from the cracks, but as they widened, the four of them also saw that human skulls were falling out too. Their attention was drawn to the temple when they heard a large groaning come from there. For a moment, they watched in silent horror as it burst open and a virtual tidal wave of skulls flooded out of it. Out! Shouted Aragorn. They ran for the other side of the cavern, where the path continued on. But the flood of skulls had already reached their feet and their knees, making it much more difficult to make their way through. For a moment, it almost looked like Gimli would be overwhelmed by the skulls until Legolas and Hugo grabbed hold of him and all but dragged him through the skulls. Once they were past the initial flood and found their firm footing again, they ran into another tunnel, never looking back as rocks began to fall, blocking the path behind them. They saw a light from a way out back into the open world and they ran harder to it, wanting to be free of what chased them. They burst out of the cave amidst smoke and for a moment, they were glad to see sunlight. But that moment turned to anguish when they saw what lay before them. A wide river stretched out before them and on the water were ships flying the flag of Umbar. Behind them were towns that were burning. What happened to them was obvious. They had been sacked and torched. Aragorn fell to his knees. He had done what had to be done. He went to the one place he did not wish to go because it would make him call upon his heritage and his right. But when he did so, he was laughed at. Those who he called did nothing. What kind of king can I be if I am scorned and ignored? He asked himself. May the Vala have mercy on them all, Legolas said, bowing his head to the burning villages. When he was done, he went forward to put a comforting hand on his friend's shoulder. Those corsairs should for everything they'd taken with blood, Gimli said, clenching his axe with a very tight grip. They should, Hugo agreed quietly. He clenched his hands into fists and made them tremble, but there were the beginnings of a bloodthirsty grin forming of his face. There is nothing we can do, Legolas said to them in reply. Aragorn shook his head. There is always something that can be done. The problem was that he did not know what it was. A cold wind echoed in their ears, coming from the mountain and the collapsed cave, making the man stand and turn to face the mountain. From out of the rock wall came the King of the Dead. He approached the King of Gondor and uttered two words. We fight. Chapter 28, Whitestone, Black Iron. Location, Minas Tirith. Hold, Faramir said, holding his hand upward as he watched the siege towers crawl closer and closer to the wall. In the distance, he could see additional catapults being brought to the front. While these additional catapults made him nervous, he took heart in the fact that it would take them a long while to reach firing position. With any luck, his mithril-armored friend would take care of them long before they could get there. But for now, his focus would be on the siege towers that were being pushed by trolls. They were made of wood and their protection was a hide of toughened leather and crude iron hanging on the front. It would be able to withstand a barrage of arrow but not one of stones. All they had to do was to wait for them to get closer. "My lord," one of the soldiers began to say to him as the towers came closer. "Hold," he repeated, keeping his arm up. "My lord, they are getting really close." "Hold," he said a third time. The siege towers crawled forward to the walls, getting closer and closer with each second passing. Sasuke restrained the urge to roll his eyes. "They are close enough," he told Faramir. "Not yet," he replied. He wanted them all in range, not just a few. Once the last tower crossed into range, he dropped his hand and bellowed, "Now!" The trebuchets on all levels holding them snapped forward, swinging their contents forward and up into the air. The contents were large pieces of rubble that had been scavenged from Osgiliath before it had been lost again. They had a short supply and thus had to make every shot count. With each piece of rubble crashing into the towers and completely obliterating them, he felt satisfied at the sight. But then the satisfaction disappeared when he saw that a few had missed their intended target, instead hitting the orcs following. "Reload and continue attacking," he commanded. His orders were relayed up and down the wall, the engineers manning the trebuchets hurrying to do their jobs and ward off the enemy at the gate. They fired off a few more shots, but the trolls pushing the siege towers had wised up to the fact that they were being targeted and began pushing the towers faster to the walls, trying to get out of the range of the trebuchets. The catapults that the Mordor horde had were also being pushed faster to the front. The soldiers on the wall quickly suffered a setback in their defense when the remaining Nazgul appeared over the city on their winged mounts. It was almost as soon as they appeared that they started their screeching. It filled the air and the walls. All the soldiers who heard the screech grabbed hold of their ears and began to scream in pain. Those who were not strong enough fell to their knees and tried curling themselves up into a ball. The screeching was more than just a physical thing. It traveled deep into their minds where the things that frightened them hid and bid to them to come out. Even Sasuke was affected, although he did not fall to his knees or clutch his ears. He wanted to hide from the screech and wondered why the Nazgul didn't use it on him when he struck them at the ford. He later came to the conclusion that he had got them off guard. But he put his fear aside and barely activated his Susanoo, summoning up the ribs, arms, and weapons again. He swung the bow skyward, ready to knock an arrow at a Nazgul. When he had one in sight and in range, he fired. The black arrows flew through the air towards its intended target, but the ringwraiths could always see it coming. They flew out of range and allowed them to fall on the orc horde. After 5 minutes of avoiding his black arrows, they came to the realization that he wasn't firing on them when they were higher up on the walls. So they hung there in the air over the higher levels of the city, diving down to take out a trebuchet or a few soldiers. What made it worse was the fact that they were doing it at a pace one could almost consider leisurely. If he had less control of his temper, or worse, have Naruto's temper, Sasuke might have found that infuriating. But he hadn't and he didn't. Instead, he kept his fears aside and kept watching them, waiting for them to slip up. He heard Gandalf distantly shouting, "Hold them back, do not give in to fear. Stand to your posts. Fight." As he hurriedly went up and down the wall. "We heard you the first time," Krabender thought to himself. But it had the intended effect. Already the soldiers who had cowered at the screeching stood back up on their own feet. "Return fire!" Faramir commanded, and the archers drew arrows and fired them into the horde of orcs down below. "My lord, the siege towers are upon us," announced one of the soldiers for all to hear. And all who heard him swung their heads to look at the siege towers that were just a few feet away. "Do not aim for the towers!" he instantly shouted, stopping what would have been an instant reaction for the archers. "Aim for the trolls! Kill them and the towers will not move!" The archers instantly aimed their bows downward and fired their arrows. They struck the trolls and the archers enjoyed the shrieks of pain they uttered. More than a few fell to the ground dead. But even more than a few weren't enough to stop the towers from moving in closer. Sasuke swung his attention to the nearest tower and fired off an arrow at it. It tore through the top level and set every orc inside ablaze. The fire quickly spread down to the lower levels, taking more and more orcs with it along with the trolls. Once it was engulfed in black fire, it collapsed with a loud groan. As it fell, it crushed a good number of orcs waiting at the bottom to start climbing it. It also had the bonus of having the fire spread away from the wall and into the horde, reducing the numbers just a little bit more. He destroyed a couple more towers in the same manner, preventing them from making contact with the wall. The soldiers cheered each time they saw a tower collapse, their fears being brought out by the ringwraiths screeching disappearing. "Leave some for us, my lord," an especially young soldier told him with a grin. "You can have all the fun." "You baka," Sasuke thought to himself. To the soldier he said, "Keep your attention on the fight. We have a siege tower coming closer over here." Another soldier cried out down the wall to his right. He swung his attention over to where he heard the voice and saw the tower. Shit, was his first thought at the sight. The siege tower was too close to the wall now. If he tried to shoot it and set it ablaze, there was a very good chance that the wall would be struck. If the Amaterasu hit the wall, it would hit the soldiers, costing lives. They needed to make every life on the walls count. None could be wasted on something like that. "Will you not take that tower down?" Faramir asked him. "It's too close," he answered. "They'll have to take care of it themselves." "My lord!" a runner cried, heading for Faramir. It was clear that he was no soldier by his age, a boy of 10, and the lack of any armor on him. He did have a dagger around his belt. "My lord Faramir." "What is it?" the son of the steward asked him. "News from the gate, my lord," he began. "The orcs are charging for it right at this moment. They're carrying a ram." If it had been any other kind of gate they were talking about, he might have felt concerned. But the man just chuckled and said to the runner, "Go back to the gate and tell them to rain arrows on the orcs." "Yes, my lord," the runner said before turning and leaving. "Why aren't you more concerned about the gate?" Sasuke asked him. He suddenly swung the arms of the Susanoo upward and fired off an arrow, hoping to take one of the Nazguls that had drifted away from the higher level down. But it saw the arrow and promptly avoided it, letting it fall down outside the city. "No simple ram will be able to break through the main gate of Minas Tirith," Faramir told him with a note of pride in his voice. "It's too strong for the likes of that." "Tower!" screamed a nearby soldier, getting their attention. As they had been talking, a siege tower had gotten close enough to the wall to render Sasuke's arrows useless. It reached the wall, and its door swung down onto the battlements, shattering stone and sending up smoke. From out of its door, orcs poured out, readying to kill. They met the soldiers of Gondor, and with their bloodthirstiness, they took the edge of battle for themselves. Sasuke instantly deactivated the Susanoo and drew the katana. He leapt right into the fight and began striking down the orcs left and right. They may have had their thirst for blood, but he still had his Sharingan, and he could read all their movements. It was almost pitiful. He used the word almost because even if he could see all their moves, there were still a lot of them and more were coming out of the tower. If he wasn't careful, he could very well be overwhelmed by the numbers alone. Fortunately for him, the soldiers of Minas Tirith did not stand idle as he fought. They came to his aid and began killing the orcs alongside him. "Another tower is coming!" a soldier shouted from down the wall. "Over here too!" another cried from the other direction. The sight of the towers smashing down on the walls was not a sight many wanted to see. "They're coming over the wall. There are too many! Vala have mercy, we're going to get slaughter." All these cries and more filled the air as more and more towers smashed against the wall, and the orcs came flooding out. The soldiers were faltering and letting the orcs come farther out than they should. Lines were beginning to break, and it was only when a horn sounded off in the air that they stopped. The sound of the horn was the sound that every man, woman, and child knew instinctively, the horn of Gondor. All soldiers came to at the sound and the orcs froze in mid-rush, their ears ringing with the sound. "Men of Gondor!" roared Faramir for the wall to hear. "Stay to your posts. Defend your city!" Those words put the steel back into their spines. They raised their shields and their swords and with a renewed shouted, smashed back into the orcs, hacking away with all they had. The orcs, caught off guard by the horn and the attack, fell back for a brief moment. But then they started pushing back. Good move, Sasuke thought silently as he beheaded an orc that had charged right at him. The morale of the soldiers would hold them but not for long. However, he wasn't going to tell them that. Right now, they needed to keep to their posts and kill all orcs coming at them. It was a brief plan, but it was a plan that was working. The two forces on the wall moved and flowed at different sections, but the soldiers of Minas Tirith were holding firm against the orcs, only giving ground when they were forced to. Dead orcs were beginning to pile up, but more of them were pouring out of the towers. For Sasuke, it was a chaotic confusion of a mess, just like Helm's Deep and the Fourth Shinobi World War had been. And he would be lying if he denied the fact that there was something about this chaos that called to his blood. It was a small and trifling thing in all honesty, but it was still there. He wondered if that was from Madara or Indra. His wondering did not last long, otherwise he would end up dead. His focus had to stay in the fight, otherwise he would end up dead. Any orc that came close to him died. He didn't stay in one place on the wall. He moved with the flow of it, attacking wherever he went. At one point, he found himself back to back with Gandalf. "How are we doing?" he asked the White Wizard as he bisected a rather ugly-looking orc, which is saying something. He was too busy killing orcs and making sure he and others stayed alive to look beyond the wall's edge now. "With what exactly?" asked Gandalf in return as he stabbed an orc wielding an ugly-looking spear. Even though he could not see it, he was certain that there was some sort of smile on his face as he spoke those words. "Now is not the time for that, old man." "Indeed," he agreed as he bashed another orc's head in with his staff. "Well? We are holding for now, but we both know that Faramir and his soldiers will not be able to hold the wall for long. Especially if the main gate is broken open," he added. Faramir was confident that it would hold. He ducked under a crude swipe from an orc's blade, it was too crudely fashioned to be called a sword, and removed the offending hand and head. Then he kicked the dying orc at another one charging at him, knocking them both down to the ground. "It is wise to never underestimate Sauron. He will have a way to break through," Gandalf told him with a grim tone. "Then I'll make sure it won't." "You are very confident." He didn't bother to reply, instead turning back to the fight, slashing any orcs who came close. He lost himself in the chaos again, only focusing on what was in front of him that needed killing. It was made easy by his Sharingan, almost laughably easy. If things were as dangerous as they were, and he was more bloodthirsty, he might have deactivated them just so he could enjoy the fight a little more. But he wasn't like his predecessors. He would not do something like that for kicks. It might be fun to get lost in the chaos of a fight, but he had to pull himself out of it before he was too far gone, something that he had never done and had no intention of doing. "Stay on course, Sasuke," he told himself as he took a moment to breathe and refocus. It was in that moment of refocus that he realized something and promptly felt like a fool. Odds are if Naruto had known about it, he would never let him live it down. "How could I not see it?" he asked himself. It was right there in front of his face. Now wasn't the time to beat himself over the head. "Keep them off me," he told the nearest soldiers while dissecting a short orc. He didn't bother waiting to hear their response. He just moved forward and attacked. He cut a path through the orcs, the katana flashing and slicing through the air, drawing blood and arcs from dead bodies. The orcs tried surrounding him and attacking him on all sides. Normally, he wouldn't have had a problem with this and could have dealt with it with ease. But the soldiers he had spoken to had heard him and forced the orcs away from him, leaving him unhindered. Once he reached the edge of the wall, right in front of a siege tower, he activated the Susanoo again. He didn't conjure the bow or the black fire because what he was going to do was simply too easy to need them. Once they saw the purple fire encasing him, all of the orcs surrounding him backed away in fear. That turned out to be the mistake they shouldn't have made and the opportunity he needed. He simply stretched out the right arm of the Susanoo and pushed the siege tower away from the wall. It moved back only a foot or two, but that was all he needed. "Katan, Gokakyu no Jutsu," he said after flashing through the hand seals. He breathed out the fireball right at the tower, setting it ablaze and the orcs still inside it. The soldiers who saw it cheered and pushed harder against the orcs, killing them with new resolve. But he wasn't satisfied. That was just one tower. There were more. He turned to his left and began to move, deactivating the Susanoo as he went so he could be a bit more movable. He began making his way through the orcs to the next tower, cutting those who were in his way down with no hesitation. The orcs who saw him coming turned to face him only to be attacked the soldiers. It was a confusing mess for them and Sasuke took advantage of that, plowing through them like a farmer harvesting his crops. The men of Gondor saw what he was doing and kept the orcs in place, stopping them from trying to attack the mithril-armored man. 2 more times did Sasuke repeat his actions, pushing a siege tower back and setting it on fire, before the higher-ups in the horde from Mordor decided to respond. The Nazgul came swooping back on their beasts, their screech echoing in the men's ears and making them feel their fear once more. Sasuke, however, turned to face them, his hands already flashing through the necessary hand seals. Katan, Goryoka no Jutsu! He cried before breathing more fire from his mouth. The fire took the shape of a dragon's head, the kind of dragon he knew. To those who did not know the kind of dragon he knew, what they saw was a head of a creature that looked vaguely serpentine but with a hidden air of knowledge, surprisingly and oddly. They didn't pay attention to it long. The ringwraiths, on the other hand, were completely focused on it, and the others that followed after it. They forced their creatures to bank and turn sharply, avoiding the heads by mere inches. The Witch King was at the front, saw Krabender forming hand seals again. He mentally commanded the other 7 to fly higher and hang around the upper levels, assuming that the stranger from another land would not strike them. But what he didn't know was that unlike the Amaterasu, a Katan Jutsu could be put out. So Sasuke had no problem breathing more dragon heads at the ringwraiths and their beasts. If they had been human, they might have shouted, or possibly yelped, in surprise. But since they weren't, they did not. Instead, what they tried to do was quickly get out of the way. They weren't so lucky this time. 2 of the beasts were set afire and began to fall rapidly towards the earth while also trying to get back outside of the city proper. They were successful but took out another 2 siege towers in the process, and wiping out a good number of their own forces. 3 had taken a dragon head to a wing, tearing a large hole in them. The power of flight rapidly disappearing, they floundered back out of the city and to the horde, where they could land safely. Of the remaining 2, the Witch King was one of them. He stared at Sasuke for a long second and Sasuke returned the stare, his hands already forming a hand seal. The Nazgul didn't take the silent challenge. They flew away, leaving him and the soldiers unharmed on the wall. That's taken care of, Sasuke thought to himself, watching them fly away for a moment. A ragged cheer came from the soldiers, but it faltered when they saw him gaze upon them. Even as he looked at them, he managed to split an orc in half when it tried to attack him. "Fight, don't cheer," he told them. He turned and kept moving, going back to taking out the towers. The orcs had caught on to his plan and now turned to attack him more than the soldiers, trying to slow him down and prevent him from getting to his targets. It didn't work at first, allowing him to rid the left side of the city of their siege towers. But when he turned and started going back to the right, it began to slow him down. After wasting more than 15 minutes slogging through the orcs trying to attack him, he finally got annoyed with it all. The next orc that came at him, he swung the katana low and chopped off the legs. The orc fell to the ground onto its stumps, allowing Sasuke to use him as a jump-off ledge, taking off into the air. If he still had the curse mark, he probably would have used it then and there to fly to the right. Instead, he just ran over the flood of orcs on the wall, applying enough pressure when he stepped on ahead to crack it open, killing the orc. A shinobi can always find a way to kill what needs kill, one of the many lessons he learned from Orochimaru. After reaching the right and dealing with the siege towers, he found himself standing by Faramir behind the soldiers, watching them fight. "The towers are all aflame," he said simply. "We've noticed," Faramir replied with no sarcasm in his voice. Rather, relief colored it. "Thank you, my lord," a runner shouted to him as he came running. "I bring word that the orcs' catapults are in firing positions. They will start firing on us any second." "I'll take care of it," Sasuke said to the Captain General before he could even say a word in reply. He had done it before, he could do it again. "Thank you again," Faramir said with a brief nod of his head. The runner, having delivered his message, turned back and left. "My lord!" one of the soldiers shouted, getting their attention. "The ram is retreating. They've failed to break the gate." Both Sasuke and Faramir went to the wall to see what the soldier had seen. They saw the orcs who were trying to break down the gate fleeing from the arrows raining down on them. A loud cheer came up from the soldiers at those words and they redoubled their efforts in killing what orcs remained on the wall. "We may survive this yet," their leader said with hope in his voice. Sasuke shared that hope, only silently. He might have shared that cheer if he was a more open person. But he was not. Furthermore, even they had failed to destroy the gate. The orcs were still marching forward. As he watched, he began to hear them chant something. It was faint at first but quickly became louder. Grand! 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 He knew from his research that the word they were chanting was supposedly the weapon of Morgoth, the first Dark Lord. And from what he was seeing, the battering ram that was being pulled up to the gate could certainly qualify to be that weapon. It almost seemed like the moment he saw it, the smog from Mordor covered the sun, darkening the land. To say it was a battering ram would actually be understating it. The first ram that the orcs had used could be carried by them. This battering ram was held in a moving hangar by chains and was pulled by 3 gigantic beasts at the front as well as pushed by at least 6 trolls at the back. The head had been fashioned into the shape of a wolf's head with fire burning from its snarling maw and eyes. The orcs had cleared a path for it right up to the gate, chanting its name as it went. Sasuke looked back at Faramir. In the second that their eyes met, they knew what would happen. The first ram hadn't been strong enough to break the gate, but this one certainly looked like it had the power and strength to do it. It had to be stopped before it could even have the chance to strike the gate. Sasuke turned and raced for the wall over the gate. From there, he could safely launch himself at the giant and destroy it. But the orcs began swarming him again, their intent to stop him ever obvious. Apparently, they were able to learn as well. When he tried to run across their heads again, every orc he tried to use a jump board was pulled to the ground before he could use them. He hacked and sliced his way through them, but they would not fall away from the katana. In fact, they seemed desperate to throw themselves onto it. They had no regard for their own lives in that moment. It disgusted him, but that wasn't what he had to be concerned with. He had to get to the gate and reach the ram. If it struck the gate, it would break and the Mordor horde would have a way to get into the city. Location: Aragorn. The 4 of them waited at the bank of the river, watching as the corsairs of Umber sailed closer. "You may go no further," Aragorn called to them when the nearest ship was close enough, getting their attention, and Duro resting on his shoulder. "You will not enter Gondor." The men on the ship laughed at him. To them, he was a man who stood on the river bank. "Who are you to deny us passage?" The bosun challenged him. "Legolas, fire a warning shot past the bosun's ear." "Mind your aim," Gimli told the elf as he drew and nocked an arrow. While Legolas lined up his shot, something that only took a second, the dwarf used the butt of his axe to tap the bottom of his bow. It was enough to send the arrow flying not past the bosun's ear but rather into the corsair standing behind him, burying itself into his chest. Legolas knew it had been him who did that, but he still acted surprised, putting his hand to his mouth and saying, "Oh." He pretended to quickly recover himself and told the corsairs, "That's it, right? We warned you. Prepare to be boarded." Again, the pirates laughed at them. "Boarded by you and whose army?" one of them challenged as the ships sailed past. "This army," Aragorn whispered. It wasn't loud enough to reach the ships, but it was loud enough to linger on the air. With those 2 words, Hugo shot across the water, his feet slapping against it as his arms morphed into jagged gauntlets and a grin that thirsted for blood appeared on his face. From behind Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli was a cliff, and from out of that cliff came the King of the Dead and his army. They charged out onto the water and followed Hugo to the ships. The laughs of the corsairs turned into horrified screams as the monsters fell upon them. Chapter 29: When Help Arrives. Location: Minas Tirith. Night had fallen, but the sky was continually streaked with large flaming pots fired from the orc catapults, briefly but always giving it an ugly orange shine to it. The fire pots struck the buildings more often than the soldiers, but it caused just as much confusion. Some of them tried to put the fires out, but most of the soldiers were quickly heading to the main gate, where Grand was ramming itself against it. The booming sound it made on contact with the gate was a loud, echoing sound that hung over their heads as they moved. It also made them want to stop what they were doing, turn around, and run. In all the time since its foundation, not once had the main gate of Minas Tirith ever been broken through. But now, there was something outside the city that was putting that statement to the test and destroying it with every pounding. That alone sent chills down the spines of the men of Gondor and stilled their feet. But there was more. If the gate was broken, the orcs would come flooding in, attacking anything and everything that even looked vaguely like a man. And that wasn't the worst of it. The worst was the fact that they had seen Sasuke, who was known as the Bellman and as Crabender, who had destroyed both catapults and siege towers with ease, and had fended off the ringwraiths with an ease that could inspire both awe and jealousy, failed to reach Grond and destroy it before it got to the gate. The orcs on the wall had thrown enough of themselves in front of him and onto his sword to delay him long enough. It was disheartening to say the least. All these reasons were enough to make any of them turn and run. But they didn't. Partly because of the fact that this was their city and they would not let it fall so easily, and partly because both Faramir and Gandalf urged them onwards, shouting, "To the gate! To the gate! Hurry to the gate!" Sasuke was curter in his urging. "Leave the fires!" He shouted at some of the soldiers trying to put out a nearby burning building. "You won't be able to save it, and you're needed elsewhere now. Get to the gate!" "But my lord!" One of them tried to start protesting. "Go!" He did not shout the word nor did he scream it. He said it with a clarity and calmness that made them feel a chill crawl up their spines. They did as they were told and followed the rest of the soldiers. "To the gate!" cried Faramir as the soldiers reached its courtyard, the pounding of the ram even louder there than on the wall. They could see a few soldiers still on the wall shooting down the other side of the gate, but few even had a smidgen of a hope that it would do anything. "Form a defensive line!" Sasuke shouted at the soldiers, pushing the few stragglers into the developing line. It was a shaky line of defense. Archers struggled to pull out arrows from their quivers and knot them to their bows. Meanwhile, the other soldiers tried to stay true to the classical defense strategy of Gondor, where one soldier would be open to the enemy wielding a spear and was protected by two other soldiers holding shields to his sides. The idea was to funnel the enemy into those open spots, where the shields would step forward and cut them off from the rest of their forces. This was already happening, but it was ragged and there were more than a few gaps in the defense, either due to a lack of spear in one spot or a shield in another. Soldiers with either tried to fill those holes, but they had to push their way through other men in the line to reach the hole, and that slowed them down. Even as they formed the line, the sound of Grond battering at the gate filled them with unease. They were hearing something that they didn't really want to hear. Not even Sasuke wanted to hear that sound, and he had tried to stop it from ever occurring. He stood at the front of the line, his hand resting on the katana's hilt. "Steady! Steady!" Gandalf called from the back, riding atop Shadowfax. His words kept the soldiers in place in the line, keeping them assured and confident despite the situation. Once again, Grond banged against the gate. But this time, the gate gave way with the screech of wood tearing itself free and the sound of chains shattering, creating a large hole in it. The wolf head of the ram appeared in the hole, frightening the soldiers. It looked like something out of their nightmares, and caused more than one of them to lose control of their bladders. But no one said a word about the smell that suddenly arose amongst them, or the sight of wet breeches that appeared 1 second when they weren't there before. The wolf head pulled back and they knew that the next strike would force the gates open. Once they did, the orcs could come flooding right in. "Remember who you are!" Faramir shouted to the men from where he stood on the opposite end of the line from Sasuke. "You are soldiers of Gondor. No matter what comes through the gate, you will stand your ground and make them bleed." The wolf head appeared once more and struck the remains of the gate, forcing it open just like everyone knew that it would. But what came through the gate first weren't orcs but trolls. Armored trolls wield crudely spiked but very large clubs. "Vala, have mercy!" someone screamed. "The Vala aren't here!" Sasuke shouted back. "We are!" "Volley!" bellowed Gandalf. The archers drew their arrows and fired them onto the trolls. Those that did have body armor were able to withstand the volley, but those that didn't were struck and fell with screams of brief agony. There were still more coming at the line, but luckily for them, Sasuke was there and he knew how to take care of them. Chidori-Saban. His hand shined with lightning in the moment before he threw it. The jutsu found the targets it was sent at, striking each armored troll in the chest plate. The lightning coursed through their armor and through them, sending them to the ground with a large crash, apparently dead. The soldiers might have cheered at the sight, if they didn't see the virtual flood of orcs coming right at them. The defensive line stiffened up and the spears were lowered. There were twofold problems Sasuke and Gandalf instantly recognized with the line. The first was that it was still ragged with a few holes. The second was that the orcs did not simply charge at the spears, rather they just charged the line in its entirety, smashing against it like a wave. For a moment, the line buckled and they thought it would break. But the men of Gondor were made of stronger stuff than that. They held and fought back, blocking the weapons with their shields and killing the orcs with their swords and spears. Knock arrows and fire at will, Faramir shouted to the archers in the rear. They did as they were ordered and rained a volley of arrows onto the orcs. More trolls are coming in, Sasuke shouted down at him, already seeing the next round stomping their way through the gate. Before the Captain General could respond, Gandalf came through the lines and rode Shadowfax towards the trolls. It seemed like the wizard and horse would be smashed by the clubs the trolls held in their hands. But to the surprise of many, on both sides they seemed to dance out of the way of the clubs while Gandalf struck the trolls down with Glamdring. But he was only able to get a few as more came in along with a lot more orcs. Sasuke was at the front of the line, but he could see it beginning to crack and break. Orcs were beginning to get through the line, and even though they were struck dead by the arrows of the archers, soon that wouldn't matter. Sasuke found himself out in front of the deteriorating line surrounded by orcs. He wasn't frightened by this, but the orcs seemed intent on trying to kill him, with the key word being trying. He held his ground and killed any that got too close with the katana. As he was surrounded, he found that time seemed to have become meaningless. All he could see were orcs all around him trying to kill him. He let his focus stay only on that fact and dealt with each one that came at him, one after another after another after another and after another. It became repetitive, even a little boring. But he quickly banished the thought of boredom. If he got bored, he could end getting killed. And getting killed by an orc of all creatures when he wasn't caught off guard was not the way he would be dying. I need to get out of this spot, he thought to himself. The orcs might not have been very smart, but whoever was commanding them, whether it be the Witch King or Sauron himself, seemed to realize that he would be a threat to their plan. So, they decided to stall and slow him down by throwing away orcs at him. It's a tactic that worked before, having prevented him from dealing with ground, so they were apparently inclined to do it some more. As he split an orc in half and then turned to cut another one's head off, he tried to get his bearings back and know which way he was facing. But he soon found out that it was harder than he originally thought. The orcs were crowding him, making him see only them, and he had kept moving and turning in place so he wasn't facing the gate. If he tried cutting his way out, there was a good chance that he would either up reaching the soldiers or more orcs, and it was 3-to-1 odds with the latter. He spun in place, swinging the katana low and making the orcs back off. He pressed forward in one direction, deciding to take his chances. He began cutting his way through the orcs while those behind him pressed against him and tried to attack his back. Damn it, he mentally growled as he forced to stop and deal with the orcs at his back. He might be wearing mithril armor, but that didn't mean he couldn't be killed from a stab in the back. As he fought them off, he heard the sound of another sword cutting through the orcs. Someone was coming. "Sir!" cried young Oda as he fought his way to Sasuke's side. Once there, they stood back to back, fending off all the orcs. "What are you doing, Oda?" Sasuke asked him as he kicked an orc back into the crowd. "I'm trying to help you, sir," he replied. The raven-haired shinobi couldn't see him, but he heard the sound of a sword piercing flesh. "You're not. You're stuck with me now." "That's not a bad thing, sir." He would have retorted that statement if he hadn't been busy removing an orc's head from its body. "Let's just get out of this trap. Follow me." He began cutting his way again, slicing down the orcs in his path. Oda followed him, keeping the orcs off his back. For that, he was grateful. But once they were out of the trap, they saw the condition of the defensive line. It was bad. There were multiple holes in it, and the orcs were pouring through them. The soldiers were breaking, many already cut down, their bodies being stepped over like they were nothing but rocks in a stream. A roar filled his ears and he turned back to the gate. More trolls were coming towards the line with clubs raised high. He went right for them, not even bothering to think about it, which was quite unlike him. It was something Naruto would do. The trolls roared in challenge at him and moved forward to him. When the clubs came swinging down, he sidestepped it and cut the troll's leg to the bone, making collapse with a howl, which Oda silenced with a stab straight in the roof of its mouth, killing it. He leapt into the air at the second troll and plunged the katana into its eye, sending down to the ground with his force. But as he stood up from the corpse and pulled the katana out of the socket, he heard Oda shout, "Look!" Before the world went sideways fast. The first sensation he felt was that he was flying. The next was pain as he hit a building and fell to the ground. He wasn't sure how long he had been out. To him, it felt like a few seconds, but it could have been longer. When he did open his eyes, the first thing he noticed was his helmet laid on the ground more than a few feet away from him, smashed by a club. Right next to it was Oda's bloody corpse. The side of his torso had been caved in, along with half his face. Maybe he was trying to still fight the trolls, or maybe he was trying to get away. But it was obvious that one of them had killed him like it was nothing. Naruto might have felt anger or outright rage at the sight, but Sasuke could only manage a simple "damn it." He wasn't sure what Oda had been to him. He wasn't a friend, but he was something. But now he was dead and someone was going to have to tell his grandfather. As he shook the dizziness from his head while getting back up, Sasuke realized that thought for what it was. Young Oda was dead and someone would have to tell old Oda that news. Silently, he decided that it would be him. He owed the old man that much. The sight of a fireball hitting the building and the sound of someone shouting "retreat" snapped him out of his dizziness and back into clear focused reality. There was no defensive line anymore. The soldiers were in full retreat, turning their backs on the orcs as they ran. He got back to his feet and joined the back of the retreat, pushing the soldiers beside him to get ahead. "Fall back through the second gate," he shouted to them all as they all ran out of the courtyard into the city. "The city is breached," he heard Gandalf cry from the front. They were running up the road that would take them to the second level. While this would help keep lives lost to a minimum, it would also let the orcs follow them right to it. "Look out, troll!" one of the soldiers shouted in horror. Sasuke turned to look at the troll leading the orcs behind. He stopped and took a ready stance. "Go!" he told the soldiers beside him, glad to see that they didn't argue, only ran. But as he was ready to face the horde, a hand grabbed his shoulder. "Sir, we can't hold them here," the soldier beside told him. "We have to get back to the second level and reform the line with the reserves." He could see the logic behind those words but wanted to stay and take them down anyway. It was only when he heard the horn of Gondor blast through the air that he pulled back, recognizing it as a rallying call. He turned and ran for the gate along with the rest of the soldiers, with the orcs of Mordor hot on his heels. When they went through the second gate, the orcs were too close for it to be closed, and the defensive line was barely formed. It broke too quickly and the fighting soon spread through the entrance area of the second level, becoming house-to-house fighting. And while the soldiers might have known the city like the back of their hands, the orcs and the trolls had the numbers. The defensive line was scattered and pushed back into the buildings and the streets. They could hear the horn blowing and the wizard shouting, "Fight! Fight to the last man! Fight for your lives!" But they were losing ground faster than they could gain it. "We have to pull back," Sasuke shouted up to Gandalf once he was close to the wizard, standing beside Shadowfax. A pale Pippin stood by his side with his sword out. It was stained with orc blood, showing that he was fighting. "If we pull back, we'll lose more ground," Gandalf told him in reply. "If we don't, we'll lose more men than we can afford." "We need more men then." He blocked a wild swing from a crude mace and decapitated the orc holding it. "We don't have any more. We placed the reserves on the second level and those reserves are now fighting." "Wait, I know where there are more men!" Pippin suddenly shouted over the sound of the horn blowing. "The men of the Tower Guard, they have not been committed. If we can reach them, they could help us turn the tide." Both man and wizard stared at the hobbit. Gandalf smiled at him before grabbing hold of him and putting him on Shadowfax. Before Sasuke could say anything in protest about he could get there faster, the two of them rode off. Seeing that there was no use wasting breath about it, he turned back to the fight, making his way through the streets. Again, he lost track of time as he fought. It seemed like it was still night in the sky 1 second and the next, dawn began to shine. But at that moment, it didn't matter. All that mattered was that he dealt with the orcs in front of him. He carved a path through them as he made his way through the streets, leaving their dead corpses in his wake. "Gather on me," he told the soldiers he came across in the midst of battle, killing the orcs that had been fighting them. They didn't bother to look surprised at his presence once the orc corpses hit the ground. They did as they were told and followed him through the streets. The group grew larger and larger as they moved through the streets, rescuing more and more soldiers that had been trapped. All the while, they heard the horn blowing. History, songs, and storytellers would later say that Faramir had blown the horn of Gondor 9 times in defiance of the Nazgul, as Gondor had not yet heard of the Tainted's defeat by Azuna, making the orc horde pause each time and letting his men rally to him each time as he pulled farther and farther back to the third gate. But in that moment, Sasuke could not have counted how many times he heard the horn. It just seemed to go on and on without ending as they fought their way through the streets. But when it did finally seem to end, there was a moment of silence. Then, as if in response to its call, another horn sounded. Sasuke and his group were having a moment to catch their breath when they heard the other horn sound. Compared to the horn of Gondor, which was like a high, loud, and sharp sound that blasted the very air, this horn sounded lower and longer that floated rather than blasted. As it faded, it sounded again with more horns joining in the sound. "What is that?" one of the younger soldiers asked, looking up at the sky in spite of the fact he knew he would see nothing there. His question was answered by one of the veteran soldier, who had a relieved smile on his face. "That is the hunting horn of the Rohirrim," he said. "Theoden's riders have come." Uncertainty washed over the men at that news. Was it truly the Rohirrim come to save them? Or was it a cruel trick of Sauron to raise their hopes only to crush them? They did not know, and that made them nervous. As the horns sounded again, Sasuke looked at them all. "Worry about whether it's them or not later," he told them. "We need to get to the 3rd level. Now move." He led them back through the streets once more. The riders of Rohan had indeed arrived to aid Minas Tirith in its hour of need, arriving with the morning light, which was muted due to the smog from Mordor covering the sun. Their arrival on a small slope overlooking the fields and the city and the horns were enough to make the orcs outside the walls stop and look at them. They were an impressive display, all confident riders of horses, and at a distance they seemed endless, a virtual forest of spears. Theoden rode forward a little ways from his men, looking upon all the death and destruction that was being wrought before his eyes. In the front of the army, Izuna sat on his horse, clad in his grandfather's armor and holding his grandfather's glaive. Beside him was Eomer. Neither said a word to the other. And even though he did not look back, Izuna knew that Eowyn and Merry were somewhere in the army. "King Theoden?" asked Izuna in reply, urging his horse slightly forward to meet him. "Would you grant me the honor of riding by my side?" The half-elf was surprised by the offer. It was plain to see on his face, and it was all he could do to nod. "Thank you," the Lord of the Mark said in gratitude. Then he turned his attention to his sister son and began giving orders. "Eomer, take your ear down the left flank." "Flank ready!" shouted Eomer as he turned his horse to his men. He turned to his soldiers, still riding up and down the line, never noticing that one rider would not meet his eyes. "Arise! Arise, riders of Theoden," he said to all of them, letting his voice be heard as he spoke the words of the last prayer. "Spears shall be shaken, shields shall be splintered, a sword day, a red day ere the sun rises." As the first line of riders lowered their spears, the orcs lowered their pikes into a defensive line. But the Rohirrim paid them no mind. Their focus was on their king, who had drawn his sword and rode down the line, hitting the metal tips of the spears before him and letting the sound echo in the air. Ride now, he called out to them. Ride. Ride for ruin and the world's ending. As the last sound echoed and faded in the air, he turned his horse to the orcs but looked back to his men. He could feel in himself, this would be his last ride. He did not know why, but he knew all the same. But he would not let that hang over him. Death! He shouted to his men. Death! They shouted in return, feeling his defiance from his word. It was like it resounded in their hearts. "Death!" he cried once more. "Death!" they cried in return, feeling more of his defiance coursing through themselves. "Death!" the king of Rohan roared one last time. This time, the full force of his voice, his word, his defiance, his unknown knowledge of what was to come washed over the Rohirrim like a wave washing over a rock. In that moment, they shared in his defiance and roared death. One last time for all to hear. And amidst those voices, a hobbit and a shield maiden joined. "Forth, Yorlingus!" cried Theoden King. In response to their ancient battle cry, the riders of Rohan lifted their horns and blew one more note, a long and low note that sounded like it was a call to a hunt. Izuna urged his horse forward as the king did the same. At first, it was just at a trot, but then it began to change into something more. The half-elf began to feel his blood boil at the sight of the orcs waiting before them with lowered weapons, urging him to get there faster. He wasn't alone in that urge. The rest of the army had begun urging their horses from a trot to something faster. By the time they had reached the gallop, the entire army was charging head-on to the horde from Mordor, intent crashing into them. But whoever was in command of Sauron's forces knew how to respond. Archers came forward from their ranks and lifted their bows to the air. In a part of his mind, Izuna knew that they were firing arrows upon them, and he also knew that men behind him were dying. But he found that he did not care about it. He wanted to meet the orcs in battle. He wanted to send them running as he rode them down. Just as quickly as the charge had started, he found himself leading it. With a grin that could have bordered on madness, he urged his horse onward to the spears of the orcs. He leveled aglows at them and took no small pleasure in seeing them back away from him, and the riders behind him, raising their spears in fear of the sight. And they should be afraid of what they saw. They had thought that with numbers alone, they would be able to crush any foe before them, not even bothering to bring their own cavalry to this battle. Now they would feel the full brunt of their mistake. As he drew closer and closer to the horde, his grip on aglows steady and his aim true, a battle cry tore from his voice, echoing in the seemingly quietness of the air. "Gil-galad!" he roared as he smashed into the orcs, the first of many. The Rohirrim crashed into the orcs like a wave breaking through a wall. A great many of them were just mowed down by the galloping horses. Those that weren't run over were hacked down by the spears, axes, and swords of the riders. They tore through the first line of defense so fast that they were through in a matter of seconds, already riding for the second line. The orcs in that line back away just as quickly as the first line had, and they had ridden through just as easily. But by then, the riders had slowed down in order to prevent their horses being ridden to the point of death from exhaustion. The charge had stopped, and now it was just a straight fight. But they had driven far enough through the orcs' lines to cause chaos and disorder. Their attack only aided that. The orcs found that they could not hold against the men on horseback. That fact seemed to make them turn and run. Izuna found himself to be in his element as he attacked fleeing orcs, killing them with a slice from aglows. He was beside both Ymir and Theoden as they killed orc after orc. "Drive them to the river," Ymir cried as he saw the orcs run. "Make safe the city," Theoden ordered with a victorious smile. His riders began to urge their horses forward to do as they were commanded by their marshal and their king, but just as the horses began to gallop again, their riders reined them into a halt. Theoden looked at what they saw and his smile faltered. Izuna looked too, and in that instant, realized two things that knocked his element out of him. The first was the fact that the orcs weren't running away so much as, for lack of a better phrase, they were backing up. The second was that Sauron hadn't been so arrogant to not bring his own cavalry. It had just taken longer to get the front lines. The Mordor cavalry came in the form of several large creatures stomping their way towards the Rohirrim. Gondor knew these creatures as Mumakil, which came from Far Harad and were a favored tactic by the Haradrim in war. While the men of Rohan did not know this, they did know what they could see. 1. The creatures were incredibly large, possibly over 20 feet, and carrying large wooden structures on their backs with people on board chanting in the tongue of the Haradrim. 2. Each creature had 6 tusks, 2 long ones on top of their mouths, 2 stubby ones above those, and 2 short ones on the bottom, a long trunk that hung between the tusks, and it looked like they knew how to use them. 3. On the trunk of each creature were symbols painted in red and black that showed the Eye of Sauron. An eerie horn sounded in the air from where the Mumikil were, and it made the creatures move faster than they were before. But it also snapped Theoden out of the state of stunned awe he was in. "Reform the line! Reform the line!" He ordered his riders, who quickly did as they were ordered, reforming the line of attack. "Sound the charge. Take them head on. Charge!" he cried as Gomling blew his horn again, charging forward to meet the new enemy. The Rohirrim followed their king into the battle once more, screaming their defiance as they rode with weapons at the ready. But their screams quickly turned into ones of shock, horror, and pain as they reached the Mumikil and the creatures began swinging their tusks. Some of them had spikes attached, and some had cords of rough spiked rope tied between the long tusks, creating a line just above leg height on a horse. But no matter what was on the tusks, once the creatures started swinging them back and forth, the men of Rohan and their horses were sent flying. The tables had turned so fast that blinking hadn't even been considered. Now the Rohirrim were the ones on the run, breaking up their charge to avoid the giant creatures. But the Mumikil weren't so easy to lose, especially with the Haradrim steering them. Those who were not quick enough were either sent flying to their deaths from the tusks and spikes or crushed underfoot by the feet and rope. The problems didn't end there. They also had to deal with the Haradrim warriors being carried atop the Mumikil. They were skilled archers and showed that skill by shooting down many riders below them. The Rohirrim that carried bows returned fire, and they did, but not as many as they would have liked. Most of their arrows struck the hide of the creatures, which didn't seem to do anything. Izuna was a part of a small group trying to get out from under one of the Mumikil. It seemed like they would not live after this battle, much less win. But Izuna kept faith in the belief that they would win. He would not abandon the battle, not after making that promise to the king. Even so, more than a few of the riders with him were killed as they escaped. The rest of them scattered across the battlefield. The half-elf took a moment to look at it all. This isn't good, he thought to himself as he kept riding. But as he rode, he saw Eomer atop his horse facing down the very Mumikil he had escaped from and at the Haradrim steering it. Without any warning, the third marshal of the Mark switched his grip on his spear and threw it at the steering Haradrim. The spear buried itself in his chest, and he fell off the head of the Mumikil dead. But he was also tied to the creature by a rope to its ear, and when he fell, the rope snapped taut, making the creature bellow in pain. It turned in the direction of the pain in order to get rid of it, but it was still there. As it kept walking, it crashed into another Mumikil, breaking its leg and sending them both down to the ground. A ragged cheer came from those who saw it. Now they knew that these creatures could be brought down, and once it was so, they would not get up. They heard another creature bellow as it fell to the ground, unable to get up. Izuna noticed that riding away from the fallen creature were Eowyn and Mary, with her holding 2 swords and he the reins. What they had done came to him in an instant. She went after the legs with the swords. "Nicely done, my lady," he silently praised her. "Aim for the heads," Eomer commanded the nearby riders, a bow in his hands. The archers began shooting their arrows at the head as they were commanded. The Mumikil didn't like that and began standing on its hind legs to avoid them all. "Bring it down! Bring it down! Bring it down!" Theoden shouted, gesturing almost angrily at the creature. As if to obey his orders, his disguised niece rode up behind the Mumikil, this time bearing a spear, which she threw into its leg. The creature bellowed in pain before finally falling, but in the process Izuna lost sight of Eowyn and Mary. Without any warning, the half-elf was pulled off of his horse and sent to the ground. An orc stood over him with a sword in hand. Aeglos was more than a hand's reach out of grasp, but that didn't mean Izuna was defenseless. He lashed out with his foot and broke the orc's leg, making it fall to the ground. He rolled out of the way and came up with Aeglos in hand. He saw that the orcs were regrouping and beginning to attack again. With their ability to charge severely hindered by the Mumikil, the riders of Rohan could not use speed as a weapon. But they still had weapons proper, and they used them against any orc who tried to fight them. "Gil-galad!" shouted Izuna as he rushed to the nearest orc, decapitating him with a swing of Aeglos. The other orcs took notice of him, and most of them charged right at him. He met them gladly, sparks flying off of both swords and glaive. He killed 2 in rapid succession with Aeglos. The third had a bit more skill to his sword but not enough to save him, especially against Sharingan. With those eyes, Izuna saw Yoan fighting close by her uncle's side, killing orcs on foot while he was still on horseback. "Where's Mary?" he asked himself. The hobbit was nowhere in sight. The sound of a hammer striking the gate filled the entranceway to the third level of Minas Tirith. The city's soldiers had managed to get past the gate and close it, but now, it was all they could do to keep closed and locked. Despite the tense air, and some took it like it was a moment of respite, Pippin, Gandalf, and Sasuke sat on a nearby set of steps that led to a house with their swords out and ready. "I didn't think it would end this way," Pippin confessed to the wizard and shinobi. "End?" repeated Gandalf with a small smile on his lips. "No, the journey doesn't end here. Death is just another path, one that we all must take. The gray rain curtain of this world rolls back and all turns to silvered glass. And then you see it." He paused and the hobbit asked, "What? Gandalf? See what?" "White shores and beyond, a far green country under a swift sunrise," he answered, the smile still there. "Well, that's not so bad," Pippin said with a smile of his own. No, it isn't." He saw the frown on Sasuke's face. "Do you disagree, Krabinder?" "It's a nice image," the raven-haired shinobi said, "but what about those who are still stuck behind the rain curtain?" He had been talking about himself in part, but mostly of Faramir. All three looked at the Captain General of Gondor, staying with the soldiers to keep the gate closed. As Gandalf and Pippin had ridden for the top level, it turned out that Denethor had had the same idea, was already marching down to the battle with the tower guard at his back. All seemed good, until the Witch King appeared and ambushed them, slaughtering most of the guard and breaking Gandalf's staff when the wizard tried to force him away. Denethor had been the one to force the Nazgul away but lost his life in the attempt. According to what remained of the guard, Gandalf, and Pippin, his last words had been, "You will not take my son from me," as he had charged at the Witch King. Those guardsmen now helped hold the gate shut, their spears mingling with those of the common soldiers. That pounding sound wasn't going away and the gate wouldn't hold forever. They knew that Theoden and his riders had made it to the battle and a good portion of the horde away, but someone on the wall also saw Mumikil and Haradrim join the battle and turn the tide against them. They would get no help from them. They were alone in the city. "Soon, that gate will break open and the orcs will come flooding in," Sasuke thought to himself. "How many more levels will we retreat from before we're all killed? When do we start moving the civilians lest they get killed?" "You're pathetic," Indra's voice said from inside his head. "Time was that you could have beaten back this horde with ease." I could have. But I would have set this place ablaze in the process, and the people living here would have nowhere else to run to." "Humph, pathetic," the voice snorted in contempt. "And are you planning to die here as well?" "I have never planned my death. But it looks that way. And he would not resist if it was. He may die if the orcs broke through the gate, and when he arrived in the afterlife, there was a very good chance he would be judged for his actions in life. But he would take a lot of orcs with him before he went." "You don't plan on calling for help?" He asked the question but made it sound like he knew the answer already. "What help can come to us? The Rohirrim have lost their advantage and are stuck outside. We're alone here." "No, you're not." Sasuke couldn't help but scoff. "And what is coming to our aid?" "What you've been hounding me for ever since I revealed I could reach back in time," Indra answered him. It was an answer he did not expect, and it showed in his reply. What? What did you do?" "What you thought I couldn't. I asked for help. They're waiting, you know, for you to tell them to attack. Now, are you going to call on them or are you too afraid?" He didn't answer the question. Instead, he stood up from where he was sitting, drawing looks of confusion from Gandalf and Pippin. They were here? They were truly here? Hope rose in his chest at the thought. Indra was right. If they were here, they would need to be signaled. The question was where to signal them from. He looked up to the nearby wall and immediately dismissed it. It would not be high enough to send a proper signal, not with the orcs right below it creating chaos. No, he would have to send it from a place high enough to be seen or heard. As his gaze traveled along the height of the city, they came to a stop at the spur of at the 7th level, where the one could see the entirety of the fields. He had sheathed the katana and started running up the street before he had realized that he was moving. The buildings around him began to blur away as he picked up speed, but it seemed to him that he wasn't going any faster. He had to get there. When he reached the base of the spur, he changed course. Instead of racing through the levels, he simply ran up the side of the spur. It took less time, and yet it didn't seem like it to him. But when his feet stopped feeling rough stone and instead felt smooth pavement, he knew he had reached the top of the spur. He turned to the end of it, where it was narrowest. There he saw the battle in the fields. From that lofty height, men and orcs looked like ants dwarfed by Mumikil. And like ants, men were crushed by the bigger creatures. But as he looked down at the fields, he did not see where they were. For a moment, he thought that Indra had lied to him. "Where are they?" he asked himself. "I can't see them." "You idiot," another part of him said. "They're shinobi. They know how to hide themselves." But we're also talking about him. He couldn't hide himself if he actually tried. 10 years change a lot of things. Look at yourself. There was truth in those words, and they strengthened his belief and hope. He had to signal them, and he knew what to use for a signal. Folding his hands into the familiar hand seals, he readied the jutsu and raised his hands above his head. "Chidori," he whispered. He had meant it as a bright light and a sound. But as he cast the jutsu, it felt like something was trying to take control of it. Whoever it was just took it out of his hands. The first thing he saw was a flash of light so bright he closed his eyes and stumbled back. When he could open his eyes again, he saw something else entirely. He wasn't the only one. All saw the flash of light come from the spur and turned to see what it was. And in that moment, the entire battlefield stopped. Clutching the sides of the spur like it was standing on a branch was an eagle of titanic proportions. Only Sasuke knew it was his jutsu that created it because it was made of lightning. To others, it just would have looked blue. It looked down at the battlefield, taking in everything it saw like he had down. No one moved, no one said a word. Even the Mumikil had stopped moving. Later, it would be remembered that in the moment it flashed into existence, the smog coming from Mordor vanished, leaving nothing but blue skies and bright sun. Finally, it spread its wings and lifted its head, opening its beak. A cry came forth from it, a cry that sounded like it came from an eagle, but it also sounded like the cry from the Chidori itself. 2 more times it made the cry, never changing tempo or pitch but always making the echo seem to last longer each time. Then it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Sasuke ran to the edge as soon as it vanished, looking down at the fields. For a long, horrible, dreaded second, it didn't work. But then that second passed. The first thing that happened appeared from out of nowhere was a large fox easily the same size of the Mumikil, glowing as brightly as the sun. It charged at the nearest Mumikil and took it down with 2 swipes of its claws. It stood over the fallen body of the beast, opened its mouth, and roared. The second thing that happened was a battle cry he hadn't heard in a decade. But hearing it now as another Mumikil fell with a roar of life-ending pain, it felt like he only heard it yesterday. He couldn't help but smile as he heard Schnar. Something had happened, Yoan knew that much. She couldn't see what it was. The Mumikil were being slaughtered by something that wasn't them. She had seen the eagle atop the city and had thought it to be a signal. But to who, she did not know. She was thankful to whoever it was killed the Mumikil, for they were taking Swarin's cavalry away from his grasp. "Rally to me! To me!" She heard Theoden cry to the riders of Rohan, who had been scattered because of the giant creatures. The men closest to him began to rally to his call, her among them. But before a coherent force could be formed, they all heard the screeching sound of a ringwraith. Yoan could only watch in horror as the Witch King descended from the sky and struck her uncle. It wasn't a fight. To say that it was would have implied that Theoden had a chance to fight back. He did not. The beast the Nazgul rode clamped its jaws around the king of Rohan and his horse and shook them both like they were ragdolls. Theoden screamed as he was tossed around and then tossed away, landing in such a way that he was pinned beneath his dead horse. The other riders backed away in fear of the beast, leaving their king alone there. "Feast on his flesh," the Witch King commanded his mount. The beast moved forward, its jaws already salivating at the taste of man-flesh. Theoden could do nothing but watch as it came closer. But then a soldier of his appeared and stood before the beast. "I will kill you if you touch him," he shouted at the Witch King. "Do not come between the Nazgul and his prey," the Nazgul said, but the soldier stood firm in her stance. The beast lunged at Ioin, jaws agape to bite down on her. But she twisted out of the way and with 2 strokes of her sword, decapitated it. The corpse flopped around like a drunkard trying to keep its balance, only to fall and take its rider with it. She reached down and grabbed a nearby shield, holding it in her left and her sword in her right. She knew that a Nazgul would not be defeated by a mere fall, and so she stood ready to defend her king. From amidst the beast's still twitching wings, the Witch King arose, unharmed like she knew it would be. He also stood ready for combat, holding a sword in his right hand. But it was the weapon in his left that drew her attention with growing horror. To say that it was a flail would be an understatement. The chain links holding the head to the shaft was as thick as sword steel. The head itself was a black monstrosity, spiked in the right places to inflict maximum injuries. It looked like it was heavy enough to make a strong man wince at the thought of holding it, yet the ringwraith wielded it with ease. With a screech, he swung the flail at her, almost catching her by surprise. She got out of the way of it just in time, letting the weapon strike the earth. The Witch King pulled it out and swung it around his body, and then overhead again. She ducked and avoided it again, but she could not find any spots in his defense to attack. It felt like she wasn't so much an opponent as a force of twisted nature she couldn't even try to comprehend. The short battle came to an end when the flail finally struck her shield. The thing didn't so much as break as it shattered into pieces, also breaking her arm in the process. She fell to the ground and could not get up. Standing victorious over her, the Witch King dropped his sword and grabbed her neck. "You fool! No man can kill me," he declared as he lifted her up. "Die now!" But then a surprise came for both of them. For Merry had survived his fall from the horse and had been making his way through the battlefield back to Ioin's side. He had been wounded plenty as he did this, forcing him to crawl across the ground. When he finally found her, the Witch King was holding her. Without thinking about it, he drew the dagger the Lady Galadriel had given him and stabbed the Witch King in the leg. The dagger instantly vaporized in his hand, leaving him with a pain that made him fall onto his back screaming. But his attempt to help worked. The Nazgul screeched in pain and fell to his knees, releasing his grip on Ioin. Finding the strength once again to stand, she did just that. She stood before the Lord of the Nazgul and took off her helmet, revealing her face. "I am no man," she declared before plunging her sword into the darkness that lay beneath his cowl. She held it there, twisting it ever so slightly as light inside the cowl coursed over the Nazgul. A shockwave blasted the sword out of his cowl and out of her hand, flying away from her reach. The strength she had found to stand vanished, making her fall down again. But that was nothing compared to what she saw. The Witch King literally crumpled up before her as a harsh wind blew through him, finally falling dead to the ground. But she did not care about that anymore. "Merry!" she cried, looking for the hobbit. She started crawling across the earth, looking for him. Her progress was slow, and she could not seem to find him anywhere. Her vision began to blur, and she began to see things. She saw a horde of green ghosts come flooding out of nowhere and attack the army of Mordor. Amidst that horde, she saw 2 men, an elf and a dwarf fighting alongside them, cutting great paths through the orcs. As she heard another Mumiko fall, she saw what looked to be a giant standing over it. Orcs nearby attacked one another with the ferocity and savageness she had expected, but she thought she saw looks of surprise and shock on their faces. As she crawled through the corpses of men, horses, and orcs, she saw her uncle's horse lying on the ground. Changing her course, she made her way over to it. She crawled around to find her uncle still pinned beneath. Reaching out with her unbroken arm, she cradled his head. She stayed there as the sounds of battle faded away. His eyes opened, and the first thing he saw was her. He reached out with his fingers and touched her cheek. "I know your face, Ioin," he said with a tired voice, but it was enough to make her smile. His fingers began to feel numb, and he pulled them away. My eyes darkened. The smile faded away from her face. "No, no. I'm going to save you," she protested. "You already did," he told her. "Ioin, my body is broken. You have to let me go." No, she said with shaking her head, the word barely crawling out of her mouth and hardly loud enough to be heard. But he heard it all the same. I go to my fathers, in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed. He felt his body grow weaker, and his vice darker. He kept his gaze on his niece, letting his last word be Owen. Theoden, son of Thengel, king of Rohan and lord of the Mark, died in the arm of his niece. The last thing she did before the darkness claimed her as well was weep for him.